So still working through this first planning stage where the bulk of the work is done in the continuous improvement cycle. Um, I- I'm- I've been talking a lot about using statistical tools, about consultation and gathering information. Um, and of course, this is all going to generate a big body of data for us. We should be documenting this data. It's critical to document the data so that we've got a tangible footprint in terms of what is actually happening. And this is going to inform our decision making, as I've been talking about through this tutorial. So, we need to stop and think about the amount of data that we're gathering and what we should be doing with that. And of course, when we talk about, documenting data, it's so that we can make it manageable to understand because um, if you've been exposed to big volumes of data, you know that it doesn't mean anything until we sort it and manage it so that we can then use it. That data can then be transformed to information, and that information can then feed into knowledge. So we need to think about how do we gather this data, how do we store it, how do we present it so that it becomes manageable for us, so that we can use that data to highlight areas of success or to raise issues and concerns, just like the run chart. So that's a great example of data available. Let's put it into some form that we can manage it so that it's usable, it creates knowledge for us in a sense of where it's going to tell us when we're out of control. And then that's going to identify an area of concern. And then we're going to use some of these other tools to gather more data and so forth and so forth. So then this data creates meaning for us. And from that meaning, we can use that to make recommendations or suggestions or brainstorm particular ideas. And so that data will help us to understand where we're at. If we've gathered the data over a period of time, then that data is going to help us to understand the historical context. So data from 12 months ago will let us know what we were doing this time last year. And the current data that we're collecting now will then let us know how we're comparing to that data from last year. So you see this in sales, for example. If we record the sales of our business every day, say we're a sales generating business, if we record sales from last year and now we're recording it again today, tomorrow we'll be able to compare the sales for this time last year, this time now compared to this time last year, and identify if there's any variation. And then from there, we can look at that data to see what does that variation mean? And we can have a look at whether there's a trend. So this is all circulating around the quality of the information that we can get from the quality of data. So you can see that data becomes really critical in terms of this analysis and in terms of the good evidence-based, fact-based decision making that I keep talking about through this unit. So part of that data and managing that data is about how do we store it and what do we do with it. So knowledge management systems become critical. What do we do with this data? Where do we keep it? How does it get presented? How does it get stored? Because there might be private information or confidential information in there and so forth. So we start to think about our information and knowledge management systems. The whether it's our databases or whether it's our the spreadsheet we keep on our desktop with this information, or whether it's the actual filing cabinet with paper copies if we're still doing that. So we start to think about these knowledge and information systems that we have, and then we start to think about the framework for managing those. Do we need policies and procedures around that? Because if we're going to be capturing data, we need to be able to capture it, we need to be able to store it, we need to make it accessible. And it needs to be accessible in the right format. So it needs to be accessible in a way that it makes sense to people, such as a run chart or a table. And it needs to be available at the right time and in the right place as well, so that people it's on a computer system, for example, but people also have the access to that computer system and they've got access to the computer itself. And they're computer literate. So we think about all these accessibility issues as well. But if we're going to be capturing this data and storing this data and making it accessible, then we need to think about our responsibilities around that. What about in terms of security? Do we have to have it password protected? Do people need a level of clearance before they can access that information? Where do we store it? Do we store it? Do we need a backup for it? Do we store it manually? Do we store it electronically? So we start to think about all these things as well, making sure that we have good policies and procedures and systems in place to manage this information. And there's separate information units in the qualification, but really just to bring it back to this idea of all this data that we're collecting and using as part of the continuous improvement process. So when we think about policies and procedures for managing and using data effectively and information, the things that we should be including as part of our policies and procedures are things such as how to access this information, these databases or these files or these knowledge management systems, and who has access to what levels within that system. So, different people may need different levels of access. And as part of that, do we need to have some type of gatekeeping at all those different levels so that your password protection allows you to get to the appropriate level for your role and responsibilities? And also thinking about where are we storing this? Not only where are we storing the computer, but if it's cloud based, where is it being stored in the cloud, and is it being backed up, and is it secure there? If there's either private information on there, is that information secure from being breached? If it's confidential, are our business secrets safe? Pardon me, are our business secrets safe where it's been stored? So again, thinking about the security requirements for the system, they should be embedded within our policies and procedures as well. And of course, when I talk about privacy, I'm also making reference to things like the Privacy Act of '88. So, our legislative requirements. Does our information and knowledge management systems and our policies and procedures, do they support the legislative requirements for that? And do they line up with the levels of responsibility in the organization, especially when we talk about these levels of access and so forth? So then all that goes into our policies and our procedures, and in our procedures, the specific steps that people need to go through to be able to access it. So you might have steps that are required for giving people access to the system, and then steps that are required for accessing the system. So all those type of things need to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about the procedures for accessing our information. And just to finish up talking about this, and as I said, there's separate units around this, but just to sort of bring it into the continuous improvement context, when we're thinking about managing and using knowledge and knowledge systems, it's about making sure that we're using that knowledge to generate best practice in our team. So best practice is about making sure that we incorporate the knowledge that we have of how to do something well into the broader team. So someone in our team has got best practice for doing this particular task. So we identify that as being the best way to do it in the current context. So we want to be able to then transfer best practice to the broader team. So how do we shift that knowledge of one to the many? So thinking about, using our process management, things like flow charting, training, to be able to identify what the good process is and then share it with the rest of the team. It can also be about creating communities of practice. And a community of practice is where we have an environment that is safe and secure, where people feel confident and safe enough to be able to share ideas and share things that are successful for them. So, if we're a professional team, say we're working in a project management context, or we're working in projects and we're project officers, in a team that feels it's got a positive culture of security and collaboration and camaraderie, you'll see that the project officers share information with each other. So these are the challenges that I'm having. These are the successes that I'm having, and people can take those successes to help to inform their practice, so that we're sharing best practice amongst each other. And that only occurs, as I've been alluding to, it only occurs if you've got a positive culture. If you've got a bit of a toxic environment where people don't feel safe, where there's too much competition within the team, and people are concerned about sharing their best practice because it means someone else will be better than they are, and that makes their job insecure, you're not going to get that. But in an environment where it's the opposite of that, where people do feel safe and secure, they know that we work as a team together and we work collaboratively rather than competitively, you're going to start seeing this community of practice where we're sharing best practice. And the other thing to think about is creating like expert directories for both internal and external resources. So an internal directory, for example, is having some type of formalized system where people know where that specialist knowledge is kept. So if you need information about how to secure resources, you contact these people within the procurement team. Or if you need some clarification around the legitimacy or legality of something, contact these people in the legal team. We can then put that more into a micro perspective in our teams, where we can have expert directories around areas of expertise within the team. So if Tony is the expert in this area, because that's his subject matter expert area, then Tony's a person you need to go to if you have any complex questions around this, or this other person is the person you need to go to if you have complex areas around this particular component. And where we don't have that internal or external, we can then create knowledge brokers and engage knowledge brokers, I should say. Knowledge brokers are people who can create links between us and knowledge sources. So professionally, so these occur often externally, where you can go to an industry group and they can connect you with people that you need to talk to or seek information from. So, I've got a particular industrial relations query. I'm not really sure how to handle it, and I don't have the capacity internally. I'm going to go to my local industry group, and they're going to put me in connection with some people who can specialize in that area in our industry. So they're a good example of a knowledge broker. Some of the other strategies that are really important in terms of managing and using knowledge is this reflection, and this is part of the learning organization that I alluded to at the start of the program. There's constant open mind, constant need for wanting to improve. And part of that is always being reflective. What am I currently doing? What can I be doing better? So things like post-implementation reviews, lessons learned, debriefs, these type of reflective exercises are terrific in creating knowledge, where we can think about our own personal experience and learn from those experiences, and they're often reflected against other backdrops. So we can think about our own experience in dealing with this initiative, and we can reflect on it to some of the external best practice that we've researched, and we can see that there are opportunities for improvement, and that's going to create knowledge for us. And we can share that. So from that post review and that lessons learned, I can actually then start to create a knowledge base going forward. So I'm going to put that in some type of lessons learned report, that if we ever undertake this activity again, the next person or future me can refer to that report and reflect on that as an opportunity to learn from that experience. And part of this is really about getting people within our team as well, to constantly push information out. So A learning organization in particular, if I go back to this idea of a learning organization, it's an organization where people are continually open to learning and have an open mind to be able to self-improve. Um, and that requires a culture of pushing information out, that's sharing, always looking to share information. Um, so really, when we talk about active manage or push strategies, we're talking about encouraging employees to really push their knowledge into some type of repository or some type of database. And that repository can be a team repository, so doesn't have to be like a physical database, computerized database system. It can just be like an organizational capacity. So when I talk about communities of practice, but it can also be the physical database where we're really encouraging people to build a library of expertise and knowledge